Trams are an awesome technology that takes the best of trains and buses and puts them together to create something which is more than the sum of its parts. With much of the infrastructural simplicity and flexibility of a bus, but with the capacity, robustness, and efficiency of a train. Much like other forms of transit, no two tram systems are the same. And when I was in Berlin recently, I remembered how good trams can be if operations, infrastructure, and vehicles all come together. The trams in Berlin got me thinking about what Toronto, or really any city with trams or light rail, should be thinking about if it wants more than just trams, but good trams. To be clear, these two systems are quite different. Berlin moves around twice as many people every year, and it has well over twice the mileage. But Berlin actually only has marginally more stops, and this highlights that so many of the differences between different transit systems are often policy choices. And those policy choices mean that the trams in Berlin are faster, more consistent, more reliable, and overall just better than the streetcars in Toronto. But Toronto could make the streetcars better, so what does Berlin do so right? Let's take a look. Welcome to RM Transit, a channel about trams and what actually makes them good. I want to talk about trams a lot more in 2024, because while I think they're a great technology, I think they're often misapplied, as I talked about in a video last year. And I actually think how trams are planned and implemented has a huge impact on how good they actually are. Part of the reason I think people so often like subways is that they're relatively simple in their implementation. Tunnels, trains, little interaction between routes, and no interaction with other types of traffic mean that subways are just kind of hard to get wrong. That means the gap between the quality of transit you get from the best subway system and the worst subway system, well, it's not actually that large. Trams, on the other hand, are incredibly contingent on their planning and operation, as well as wider policy decisions that impact how trams interact with the city. For me, the standout features of Berlin's tram system start with the trams themselves. Berlin's tram system is one that's evolved over time, and like many older systems, portions of the network use loops to turn trams around. And that means about half of the tram fleet in Berlin is single-ended, with a cab at only one end of the tram so that they can travel in only one direction in service. And that's fine when you have turning loops. And that variability is kind of a hallmark of Berlin's system. There are also some older trams kicking around and 40-meter 7-segment units that provide way more capacity than any bus is ever going to. By comparison, in Toronto, there's a fully homogeneous fleet, but that means that new extensions need to be built with space-consuming loops and without easy island platforms. I'll also say that the vehicles on Toronto's network aren't as visually attractive, at least in my opinion, and have more dated LED next stop signs compared to the beautiful LCD ones in Berlin. Not only do those LCD screens provide far better and more information than the LED ones in Toronto, but older Berlin trams have better screens than newer Toronto streetcars. And even the Toronto streetcars being delivered right now in 2023 don't have LCD next stop screens. And Toronto's homogeneous fleet approach to reorder hundreds of streetcars at one period and then none for years and years afterwards creates other issues. A problem specific to one model of streetcar will impact the entire fleet. And with something as specialized as trams in North America, large, infrequent orders actually probably don't provide the economies of scale you might imagine. Looking at the network, Berlin clearly has a lot of mileage, but a lot of that is inflated by long suburban lines in East Berlin, where trams were primarily concentrated. The urban parts of Toronto and Berlin systems are actually much closer together in terms of scale than you might think. But the quality of the infrastructure is not the same. Berlin has a network designed entirely for pantographs, like most modern tram and light rail systems. And it's actually increased the voltage of its system from 600 volts, like Toronto uses, up to 750, for more power and better performance. In Toronto, almost the entire network is pantograph compatible, but compatible is the key word here. Since large parts of the network still use dual pantograph and trolley pole infrastructure, a lot of the benefits of pantograph and the lower operating costs are yet to be seen. Something I noticed when traveling around Berlin is how many stops and terminating loops will have an array of multiple tracks where trams can stop and lay over. Since in Toronto only a small handful of loops have more than just a single track where trams can stop, that means you often see queuing up to go into a loop in Toronto, which means streetcars often back onto the sidewalks and block the road. The switches are different too. In Berlin, dual point switches, that is where there are two switch blades which align with both rails, are used. This means a quieter, smoother ride, but also less wear on the trams and the rails. They also have points indicators, so operators can easily see which direction a switch is pointed without having to visually inspect the points, which can be really hard to see. The switches can also easily be changed with a modern remote control system. In Toronto, it's bad, embarrassingly bad. Most, if not all, of these switches on the entire network, except at one of the maintenance facilities, are single point. And because of a dated and unreliable control system, a lack of points indicators, and these single point switches, the TTC has a policy of having streetcars slow down to a crawl before going through any switch, which is a big issue on a route like Spadina that has a lot of switches. What's crazier is that the TTC hasn't gotten rid of more switches when it's obvious that switch means slow, less switches means fast. And the tram tracks in Berlin are prettier as well. Green track is used really widely, and that's great for aesthetics, but also a whole bunch of other reasons that I talked about in a previous video. In Toronto, there is green track, but only on select parts of the Eglinton LRT, to help maintain the false distinction that some in Toronto are obsessed with between streetcar old and streetcar new. There is some talk about maybe doing green track in the Portlands, but for now it's just that, talk, and that's bad. It's also interesting to see how much more flexible and pragmatic the tram routes in Berlin are. While the vast majority of the Toronto streetcar network sees two tracks running in the center portion of a road, in Berlin you see all kinds of different arrangements, including having tracks split apart so that trams can bypass left-turning vehicles, something Toronto streetcar riders waiting for left-turning cars certainly wish they had, as well as dedicated right-of-way traveling in one direction and mixed traffic in the other, and even running trains through pedestrianized areas like Alexanderplatz. There are also places where tram routes split and each travel direction operates on a different street. This makes it easy to create turning loops without having trams go off street and then back on, which can often lead to delays and other problems. This is done by placing the loop between rather than off to the side of the tracks. The actual stops that you wait for the tram at couldn't be more different either. In Berlin, tram stops typically have large, defined platforms, often with ticket machines. Whereas in Toronto, the vast majority of stops are just a pull on the sidewalk. You have to walk into the street to get on the streetcar, and it's not entirely clear where the streetcar is actually going to stop, so you often have to do a little jog over to get to the car. The stops in Berlin are also just so much more civilized. There are these large poles which mark them from a distance so they're easy to see. And on the poles you can get real-time information, service disruption info, local maps, as well as actual schedules. Imagine that. In Toronto, service disruptions are usually just tied or zip-tied or pasted to some random object near the stop. It's not great. Now, Berlin doesn't have any underground tram stations, which is kind of a neat feature of the Toronto streetcar system. But the truth is, putting your trams underground is something that's probably to be avoided in all but the most congested areas. For one, it costs a ton of money, but you're also probably not getting subway-level service or capacity. It's also just not really necessary. The tram stop at Berlin Hauptbahnhof is just outside the front door, and if it's raining, there's a pedestrian tunnel that connects the main station with the tram stop and the bus loop, which means you don't have to get wet and you can easily connect into the station without having to cross the street, even though the trams aren't underground. It's easier to just make the people go underground. I think the biggest thing you notice in Berlin is that the stop spacings are significantly wider, which is something that's going to be pretty obvious when you note that both systems have a similar number of stops, but Berlin's system has twice the mileage. In Berlin, the first tram I got on, I was wondering if it was some weird express or out-of-service vehicle, because it felt like a long time before we made a stop, but that meant it was very fast. I actually think the bigger stop spacing is critical to stops in Berlin just being so much nicer. It's just easier to make each individual stop better when you have fewer of them. In Toronto, you do have way more stops, but none of them are very nice. And the truth is that you could combine two Toronto stops and it would still typically have less amenity than a single Berlin tram stop. There is a bigger impact of the wider stop spacing though, and that gets us into our last topic of comparison, the speed. The trams in Berlin are so fast compared to Toronto. For one, you don't stop nearly as often, so the trams are able to get up to speed and then maintain it. Since Berlin, like a lot of European cities, has way less signalized intersections than Toronto, you also stop at a lot less traffic lights. This is all despite the fact that a lot of Berlin's network operates in mixed traffic, which only cements my somewhat controversial belief that the key to making trams fast isn't really getting rid of cars, but just good operations. Heck, in Alexanderplatz, where there are no cars, trams actually travel pretty slowly, for obvious reasons. I also feel like in Berlin, the drivers are around 20% more aggressive, curves are taken faster, and you also feel more acceleration and deceleration going into and out of stops. The service is also arranged very differently. A lot more of Berlin's network has multiple overlapping routes which operate. And there are actually also different types of services, such as the M-series metro trams, which offer the most frequent service. This special branding of a certain series of routes which receive better service is exactly the type of thing I suggested for Toronto's bus network a few weeks back. Now, what's interesting is that on paper, the schedules for Berlin's trams were pitiful compared to Toronto. Every 10 minutes is pretty infrequent, but what was remarkable in Berlin was that trams actually came on schedule, most of the time to the minute on schedule. When you know that there's going to be a clock-faced tram coming at every 6-minute mark, it makes traveling so easy. You go out to the stop a minute in advance and get on your tram, and it's easy. And at worst, you're waiting 10 minutes for the next tram. It's a great experience, and so obviously better than in Toronto, where the route is spammed with streetcars, but they might be 15, 20, or 30 minutes apart, even if the supposed frequency is much higher. What's pretty clear is that despite the current lackluster state of the Toronto streetcars, there are a number of actionable things which could be done to learn from Berlin and make the network better. 1. More aggressive operations with better switches, a better switch control system, and points indicators. 2. A stop reduction and enhancement program. Get rid of the stops that are extremely close to one another and enhance the busiest stops on the network to make trams faster and to make the waiting experience better. 3. A long-term plan to increase streetcar voltages, lengthen vehicles eventually to 7 segments, widen curve radii as much as possible to enable higher speeds, as well as enabling double-ended cars. 4. Small, regular orders of streetcars with modern amenities, ideally from multiple manufacturers to keep multiple options open in the future and provide more competitive bids. 5. An aim for a less frequent but more consistent schedule, with enhanced layover and operations management infrastructure including inline turning loops and more layover space. If Toronto could learn from Berlin and other cities, it could take the streetcars, which are often seen as a cool historical gimmick for the majority of people who drive, and make them the actual backbone of the city's transportation infrastructure. Thanks for watching.